And this is a great time to take your photos to put on social media. All right, District Governor Merrick.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome to our 16th Friday feature. My name is Ed Merrick, and I have the privilege of serving as your district governor this year. We began these mostly weekly gatherings back in March after the shutdown began with the pandemic, and as a way to engage and bring the district together. Today's edition continues that concept of coming together, giving Rotary's renewed commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and its recognition that we have more listening, learning, and taking action to create more inclusive communities. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker. Anthony Galloway is the Executive Director of Arts Us here in St. Paul. He holds a degree in ethnic studies and has over 15 years of professional experience in equity and cultural programming. While studying in South Africa during the 10th anniversary of the end of apartheid, Anthony developed a passion for critical discourse pedagogy, leading him to become the co-founder of Dare to Be Real, an anti-racist student leadership framework with a growing network of over 27 sites and 1,200 students engaging. He, along with Dr. Patrick Duffy, co-authored a chapter in the book, More Courageous Conversations About Race, and are currently working together on their own book on the framework. He's a contributor to local programs, including Kamau Kabui Circle for Cultural Learning's Underground Railroad program and NPR's Counter Stories podcast. He has served as a student programming director, race equity coach, and discourse facilitation trainer for the West Metro Education Program for the past 10 years. In that time, he has led professional development and training around equity and diversity for over 5,000 educators in the Twin Cities and beyond. Please give a warm 5960 welcome to Anthony Galloway. Anthony?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be able to just spend some time to my literal job right now is to bake your noodles a little bit so that you have something to talk about. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. I should say updated since then. Arts Us is mostly a volunteer, work for me. I do receive a stipend, mileage, and stuff like that, but for the most part, that is volunteer. My day job, I'm actually a partner at Dendros Group, which is a consulting firm. And my task there is to really just to figure out where communities are having trouble talking and bridging difference, and then jumping in and saying, how can we talk through those differences? So my task is kind of to look at what all the assumptions are and put them all in a room together and make them talk. So I'm going to try to do a little bit today. In a real quick fashion, I'm going to try to get through the kind of noodle baking piece real quick so that we can move to kind of the Q&A space and in discourse space. But I want to put a few things in front of you first. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that you can see this. Just a few things I want to just put onto the table first. At present, we're going to be talking a little bit about racial patterning. So we know we have this horrible history that has come to us through a whole lot of different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about how we got here in terms of our current racial concept. But I need to stress this because this often gets taken up in news agencies and in our popular discourse and completely leaves the communities who are actually bringing them forward behind. Racial patterns are present regardless of your political view. So for those, a lot of times folks will, particularly who have more of a leftist space so far, our mindset, and leftist being really vague because we live in a liberal society on the whole, i.e., women can be out in public in our spaces. That's not true everywhere around the world. So as a whole, we live in a liberal society. So when we talk about right and left, that's in the context of a liberal society. And so regardless of your political view, racial patterns persist. But they may be and look a little different. They're present regardless of your racial identity, right? So there are racial patterns affect all of us. and they're present regardless of intention. This is huge. I am going to be telling you quite a bit of mistakes I've made in my educational career and career as an educator, as a person who supports dialogue and discourse. I've made a whole lot of mistakes, and they haven't necessarily been intentional, but they happened. And I need to do something about the fact that they happened. And so I just want to put those in front of us right away. And a lot of it comes to us because there are some things that we just assume that we know. So I'm going to real quick just, pose this question. And those, I already spoke to the Sunshine Rotary, and so they've seen this. And so I'm going to ask you to hold back and let others come through. But let's talk a little bit about our history. Everybody knows who this beautiful woman is, right? Just looking for nods on the screen. All right. So let's tell her story real quick. And so this will be a chance for you to either in the chat or just quickly on your raise your hand and I'll call it out. What's her story? Can anybody just tell me the story of this statue? That one's not rhetorical. I'm actually asking. So somebody unmute and be bold. Gift from France. Thank you, Vicky. Vicky and Lee. Gift from a French artist. Okay. All right. Others.
And the French government.
French government. Yep. Right. And this is really big in the frame of Hamilton. Now that everybody can see Hamilton, and my kids binge watch Hamilton every single moment of every single day to the point where they know every single lyric of every single song. This is very important. Marquis De Lafayette has now all of a sudden a popular character for youth these days. Symbol of taking in immigrants, tired, poor, etc. Absolutely, that plaque is right there. Give us your tired, you're hungry, you're poor. Your huddled masses, right? So there's the story that we get growing up. There are some nuances to this that actually connect directly to our racial history. Absolutely a gift from France. And this is after the Civil War, and this is actually post or kind of halfway in between what we call the Reconstruction period, where we're trying to rebuild things. And the United States Army was stationed across the South to protect freed slaves and also to protect create some stability after the rebellion ended. So in that time, abolitionists began to work with connectors all the way across the world. And there was actually a French abolitionist who partnered with local abolitionists and an Italian artist named Bertoldi to design the Statue of Liberty. And the original design had the light of freedom in one hand and broken chains in the other, because one of the things they wanted to represent is that we had ceased being a slave-holding society. So this was supposed to be part of, and they campaigned and they worked together. I don't know the history of Rotary like I should, but now I have a fleeting question about what some intersections may be for between the organizations. But it took a while to get this made. One of the things that was holding back funding and general support across the country is this notion of a gag order. After the Civil War, policies began to put in place, especially after Reconstruction, when Southern planters and generals began to proliferate into Congress, i.e. get roles. And it was part of this idea of bringing the country back together. And so there's a lot of amazing things that were happening during that time. But one of the things that also happened was a gag rule that was put into Congress that said you could not talk about slavery. Okay. Which equated to then also you could not talk about race. And we actually have some very hilarious incidents where somebody didn't want somebody to speak against their bill who might be pretty good at speaking against it. And so they would accuse them of talking about slavery or race in hushed tones, and they'd be dragged out of the halls of Congress. There's some hilarious stories about that during this time. But we were not going to go along as a country with including broken chains in the original designs. And the designers basically said, well, that's going to be a non-starter for us. And so the negotiations set out, and the folks who are trying to get this built, trying to get this gift to happen. It was going to be a national incident if we didn't figure this out. They began to raise money in order to do this. And one of the compromises they did was to compromise on the chains in the picture. So if you look at the picture, you don't see chains. Unless you get in a zoom telephoto lens and you get up above the platform, the chains are there, hidden behind the garments at the feet of Lady Liberty. And so this is a fitting metaphor for me about how we have dealt with not just racial difference, but the experiences of folks outside of the dominant culture. We hide the conversations. We're fine, perfectly fine talking about it in small controlled groups. But whenever we get to a national conversation, we very quickly bury the chains of our past behind these garments for a much rosier picture of our history. And it's not just Lady Liberty that has this. How many of you, just go ahead and nod on the video, have seen this picture of Rosa Parks? This is iconic. And what's interesting is a lot of the history books and the pictures that put this out, this has become the most iconic picture of Rosa Parks in the struggle in Birmingham, right? And so as that picture showed out, and this should be showing on your screen right now, this picture was actually taken a year after the incident happened. And what's interesting is even when I get to this part of the conversation in many groups across the United States, this is when folks tune out because it violates how I've been taught about this, and this stuff doesn't matter, and I'm going to be distracted, and I'm going to go and get out my phone. You'll be surprised how many places I speak and folks pull out their phones and are like, I'm just going to tune out until this person's done talking because it doesn't fit my picture. This picture was taken a year after this one. The actual mugshot picture that was taken the day that Rosa was arrested. And so this picture taken a year after, we only know about the second person in this picture because Time Magazine was going to run this picture as a cover and said, hey, and his granddaughter said, hey, that's my family. And everybody got I'm so sorry about your family. She's like, what are you talking about? He chose to sit in that picture. This is Nicholas Chris, and he was a white journalist who made sure that what was happening in Birmingham with the NAACP was actually recorded and put out in news agencies. Because at the time in Birmingham, it was illegal to cover Black agitation. And we only know his story because of this chance encounter at Time Magazine. And this is the other thing that we do to our history. We try to craft such a narrative that only leaves the good stuff and glosses over the stuff that we don't like, that we miss the wonderful interracial solidarity that is also part of our American narrative, right? When Crispus Attucks was shot, launching and really accelerating the unrest for the American Revolution, there was an interracial coalition of folks who were upset that drove us towards revolution over the death of this Black man. And we don't talk about that. And we don't talk about the fact that the NAACP, for example, was always a multiracial organization that had a lot of folks who agreed, some passively, some actively, and Nicholas Chris is one of them. And so when we allow ourselves to forget portions of our history, we start to remove and ignore, intentionally or unintentionally, and regardless of the intention or not, when we leave those stories out, we start to create this rift between experiences. This allows me to get to a point when George Floyd was murdered and come to a space and not understand that that is nothing new. It's just that we have video cameras. While we can give you a whole list of unarmed encounters with police officers, regardless of race, this goes back years and years and years, and folks in community are going to give you names of folks from the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way to today. And this includes things like the assassinations of Black railroad workers that happened across the South to make way for jobs that used to be Black-only jobs. They were dangerous, and they were the jobs that were relegated to Black and brown peoples, that all of a sudden became open market after the Depression. And because of the scarcity of jobs in that space, we actually had assassinations of folks to make way for other folks to get those jobs. And there's a whole string of them that happened through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Indiana. following the Indiana Railroad line. So all of this history is there, and we just don't have it because we've been enshrined and said, this is one way that you have to think about this history, and anything that differs from that must be bad, must be horrible, and all of that. I'll give you a more recent example. We take students on a civil rights research experience every year, except for this year, of course, because of COVID. And I had to stand in front of all of these babies and tell them that we couldn't go this year. That was the most gut-wrenching experience of my life. I never want to do anything like that again. I will call in sick if that ever happens again. But this was 2016 or 2015. And we were on our way to go to the National Mall to take all these folks. And here's the beauty of telling full and equal stories, right? And stories that tell the whole thing. We brought these kids to the National Mall, and I get a call from our congressional delegation. And Keith Ellison, who was in Congress at the time, said, hey, I know you're coming to visit us. We had apples that we were bringing, some Honeycrisp apples to the whole delegation there because we were going to meet them at the National Mall. And something happened and they got called into something. But Keith Ellison snuck away to be able to give us a call and say, hey, we got a message that there's some demonstration happening on the National Mall. And we said, okay, we didn't want that to interfere with our plans. So we said, thank you, keep us posted. And then he asked where we were. And I said, well, we had just pulled up on the bus and we just got the kids out of the bus. And we were lining up, counting everybody before we went to the Lincoln Memorial, which you see in the background of this picture. And it was that moment that I got silence from then Congressman Ellison. And then Congressman Ellison comes back into the line and says, disregard everything I just said. Have a good time. And I was trying to figure out, and so before he got off the phone, I said, why? And he said, well, I'm pretty sure that you are the demonstration that was called in. And I was saying, what are you talking about? We just got off the bus. Like, what's going on? And he began to tell us, his folks, as we got off the bus, began to call in and say that there was a disturbance at the Lincoln Memorial. And then when we walked in, and this is at the Lincoln Memorial, to the right of this picture, and you can't see it, there's a whole cheerleading squad that was actually doing cheerleading demonstrations there in this little grassy area that's to the right next to it. And there was a whole marching band practicing by the reflection pool. And so I'm trying to figure out why, it's starting to roll in my head. Okay, these patterns are starting to line up. The pattern of showing up and all of a sudden assuming that you're going to be somehow disruptive, right? And I was like, okay, we got a bunch of kids coming off the bus. Okay, it's because we're kids and they assume that the youth are going to be rowdy. And we walk in there and there's kids everywhere. There's school groups everywhere. It is not quiet. Even inside when it says to be quiet because it's supposed to be reflective, there are people singing. There's somebody singing America the Beautiful. Even our kids joined in and began to sing, songs that they kind of knew. It was really an awesome choir experience for anybody who's musical. The acoustics in there are beautiful. Then they were standing in the spot where Dr. King gave an I Have a Dream speech. It was just beautiful all the way around. Everything seemed like it was going really well. And then people began to talk to our students, to tell our students that they are disturbing the peace, that they need to be quiet. And our own teachers, a multiracial group of teachers, are now having to stand between folks who are starting to line up around our kids and tell us there's something wrong with how we're getting there. This is 2015 on the Lincoln Memorial, while there are many other school groups, right? And it was even fascinating. Another school group from, I want to say they were from Oklahoma. They're from that kind of Central Plains area. They joined in with our kids and intermixed with our kids because they were hearing what these folks were saying to these students. And so the students said, well, if we're going to be a disturbance anyway, we're going to call your attention a different way. And they got into a circle and they sat down and put their hands up. This is how fed up these youth were. And it was powerful because they understood the protest nature of our whole history. Our whole country was founded on protests, right? And so as they got everybody together, then they lined up 2 by 2. And this is what happens when you teach kids their full connected history. They lined up together and they began to march this whole crowd of folks. At this time, stragglers began to follow us along. And you know where they marched them? They marched them to the Korean War Veterans Memorial, where it says, freedom ain't free. And I just thought it was a powerful moment. That these kids understood enough about our history because they took our whole history and they were able to use our own memorial space because they did the research ahead of time. and march these folks by the space that said freedom ain't free, where they were the silent ones and the folks around them talking to them and yelling stuff at them were the ones that ended up being loud. And all of those things that go forward and come out from that, are a wonderful way of understanding what our history is and what it can be and how it can support us. But we got to make sure we do it in a way that's open, that acknowledges everything outright and doesn't hide it behind the garments, right? That doesn't do the battle of having to change and folks having to take that from a place of prominence to a place where it can easily get swept out. That's how we got to teach and think about our history, the good and the bad and the ugly, right? And so these kids did that. What's great about this too is later on, they went to they marched to the King Memorial, and a lone officer on horseback rolls up to check in about this disturbance that was happening at the National Mall. And the kids looked up and said, "So they sent you?" And the realization on the face of this one officer on horseback, because he didn't even think about the fact that he was told to go and figure out what's going on in the disturbance and was the only person that was sent. And so the kids had a wonderful dialogue with him about what that's looked like on the National Mall. So let's get a little closer to home for those who are in Minnesota. Does anybody recognize this thoroughfare right here?
I-94 through the middle of the town, which went through the old Rondo neighborhood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I share this picture, and of course you had this conversation, I'm assuming on Wednesday with Sergeant Carter. The Rondo neighborhood used to be on the same level as the frontage roads that you see on each side of this picture. So it's not just that this whole neighborhood was removed, and on its own, it's sad, but this is part of a pattern in many of the places during urban renewal that were selected to put these highways through. A great number of them went through Black neighborhoods who were described as blighted, designated as blighted neighborhoods that would need to be redesigned anyway. And the net result of it was removing business centers from many of these neighborhoods, and Rondo's another example. So imagine not just having your house removed to put a freeway through, but to go there and see its construction and to see a ditch be dug in the only place where you can exercise advanced degrees as a Black person in Minnesota. Of course, there's a similar area that had a similar removal in Minneapolis as well. So this is a powerful image juxtaposed to the images that we see of what used to be there, businesses, of what used to be there, different houses. And a fascinating story that I got from some of the Rondo residents is some of the fire departments used the condemned houses, many of which only received salvage title and compensation for the removal, be used for fire demonstrations and training. So you're removed from your house, you see windows and boards and things be broken up after the removal happened. Many of folks who had multiple properties in the area lost much of their wealth as a result of this, and to see them burned and used for fire demonstration. It makes it a really big deal when even a street sign is named in honor and commemoration of that area with Rondo residents who used to be there. Right. And this doesn't just affect the majority population of Rondo, which was Black, but there were white folks and there were Russian folks, there were Jews that also lived in the area, but the vast majority were absolutely African American. And so that becomes a particular part of your story that you must have told. So I only bring all of this to say is that we have a lot of learning that we have to do. And the last thing that I'll share with you is something that many of us haven't gotten necessarily growing up. Do we have any scientists on the call, folks who have a science background? Just looking for nods. All right, because the science teachers really perk up with this one, because I'm about to tell you about some of the fathers of modern taxonomy. Right. So we owe a lot of our kind of modern concept of race, big air quotes, to something that happened very recently. So when we talk about the historical construction of race as we know it today, there's three major players. There's Georges Louis Leclerc, who was the first to say that scientifically, well, first to really write out there voluminously that there's races of humans and the French were the prettiest. He would again later go on to expand that and said the Europeans were the superior of them. Then Carolus Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus, comes along in 1767 and says, yes, there are classifications along racial lines and there are behaviors and phenotypes that go along with those racial groupings. And then Blumenbach comes in there and expounds on Linnaeus's work and creates a very specific hierarchy. This is where we get the terms Europaeus, Africanus, Asiaticus, if you've ever heard that. If you go to the Race, Power of an Illusion exhibit at the Science Museum, you'll see some of the fruits of these quote unquote armchair scientists, right? So great contributions to modern taxonomy, absolutely. We owe all of our genus work from Darwin to these fathers of modern taxonomy, but they also got into the game of trying to describe this racial situation that is happening in the Americas. I want you to notice that slavery in America had already begun when these folks were doing their contributions to writings. And so I just want to share with us, and I need one volunteer who's willing to do it. Just say in the chat if you're willing to read, to just examine Carl Linnaeus's words. You can see a little bit about how these connect in frames, right? And so if we can have one person volunteer to read.
I can volunteer.
All right, thank you, Ted.
Okay. Americanus, Asiaticus, Africanus, and Europaeus. To these groups, he ascribed typological or physical and behavioral characteristics. Americanus, for example, Indians, were reddish, choleric, and erect, hair black, wide nostrils, obstinate, merry, free, regulated by customs. Asiaticus were melancholy, stiff, hair black, dark eyes, severe, haughty, avaricious, ruled by opinions. Africanus were black, phlegmatic, hair black, frizzled, nose flat, lips tumid, women without shame, they lactate profusely, crafty, indolent, negligent, governed by caprice. Finally, Europaeus were white, sanguine, muscular, eyes blue, gentle, inventive, governed by laws.
Thank you for reading that. And this can be difficult to read. And of course, the entire time, just like Nicholas Chris, there were folks who are like, you don't know what you're talking about. But there are some very interesting sticking things that stick with us over time. And so you can have a whole timeline of monumental steps towards a more equal and just society. But to the folks who are receiving the negative end of all of this work, these are things that should always have been there. And there are atrocities that are happening and continuing this entire time. And in practice, whether it says something on paper, the experience of those things has continued to be unequal and different. And we can see these even down to behavior policies in school systems. And so there's a few points I want to bring out here in this patterning. One, we have the first color being assigned to a racial category officially enshrined, right? We have the practice of this already happening in the United States. And a lot of what is happening here is coming from information coming back from the Americas, okay? And so when we talk about Native peoples, we talk about obstinate, merry, free, regulated by customs versus laws, right? We see this distinctioning of othering that's happening. For Asiaticus, this is interesting. This is during a time where we have some really deep struggles business-wise, because there are trade routes that were established thousands of years before Europe got into the game along the Silk Road, and there had to be a way to wiggle in. And so we would start to see some of the rhetoric that would come out that would say we are much better, more less greedy traders than what you'll find in that Afro-Asiatic trade route that is established thousands of years. And so you start to see things, the scriptures of, in this particular China and Thailand, of being called avaricious or haughty. And you're going to find that. You're going to find that often when it comes up, right? And so when you go back and you look at that reading, you're going to find that that comes up quite a bit. And it's going to be a little bit more haughty. I don't care what royal court you go to, that royal court is going to be more stuck up and more stiff than what you're going to find at the bar. So we start to see these things being enshrined. And then we have the descriptions of Africanus, which almost exclusively come from the slavery practice, the chattel slavery, which is different than any other form of slavery that we've ever had in the world. And you can look up chattel slavery to see how it's different. James Lowen is a historian, does a really good job of describing some of those differences. So does Lerone Bennett Jr., who wrote the book Before the Mayflower. But when we talk about women without shame, we start to see some of the hypersexualization of Black women. At one point, the Smithsonian took a woman for her African features and put her on naked display in many parts of the world. And then when she died, bifurcated her into multiple slides to look at the African body type and put those on display in many different, not the Smithsonian, oh, now it's popping out of my head. The guy, the world records, Guinness. And so as you start to see these go forward, you're looking at descriptions of our American practice. Modern gynecology owes many of its advancements to the experimentation on unanesthetized slave women. So, and yet you have a descriptor of crafty, indolent, negligent, and governed by caprice or animalistic instincts. These are the birthplace of, or the nexus point of writing about what the views were of these racial categories, i.e. the birth of a lot of the stereotypes that we still see playing out today. Finally, Europaeus, white, sanguine, muscular, eyes blue, gentle, inventive, governed by laws. So even without saying it explicitly, you're putting this hierarchy in words. Now, all of this seems absolutely ridiculous, and we're far from this stuff now. Okay, I'm going to show you a series of media images. This is a 1999 Abercrombie & Fitch graphic T-shirt. Again, looking at and playing on the knowledge, right, taxonomy around China in particular. Two Wongs can make it white. 1999 graphic Abercrombie & Fitch graphic T-shirt. We have, again, on its own, this is Volkswagen. This is the one of the American ad campaigns for the Volkswagen Bug. On its own, Black equated to darkness and white equated to light is not a problem. But when the pattern is in a mix of a whole lot of other stereotypes and it's repeated over and over again, these then tend to have and carry other meaning, okay? And the same, this is the European ad campaign for the same rollout. What is it about Europe that plays differently than the United States? Swatch even gets into the game. Again, on their own, there's no problem with describing dark, mysterious, and all of that. But when we have a mental model in place in our drinking water, regardless of your intention or your conscious thought around it, these things can permeate into behaviors. Right? We all should be very particular in the state of Minnesota and in Wisconsin around use of Native American tropes. This picture on the left was taken in Hershey, Pennsylvania on that same trip that I talked to you about with the students. Cherokee red soda, right? Where you see the earlier stereotypes that Careless Linnaeus was enshrining in their writings. And the term Redskins, we should absolutely be sensitive to, because the 1862 uprising happened here in Minnesota. And so did the ad campaigns from our own Governor Ramsey, giving state reward for proof of dead Indians that she would turn in many times at Fort Snelling. If you go to the Minnesota Historical Society, somebody from the Minnesota Historical Society sent me this actual receipt for dollars of goods and trade that included some of those scalped dollars. In 2011, Vogue magazine came out with this cover photo of LeBron James, which looks very, very similar to a World War I enlistment ad. And you can swap out that World War I enlistment ad and put in one of the advertisements from the King Kong movies. And so those are perfect. Somebody just mentioned the life of Henrietta Lacks, right? Right. And so as you look at this picture, the marketing team, a multiracial marketing team, might I add, right? So this idea that it's just white folks who think this way. No, we all internalize these stereotypes and put them forward in our ad campaigns, even down to the shoes, black shoes, white tips. Those aren't even LeBron James's brand shoes in this. All right. And so the similarities of how we re-represent these historical tropes are significant. Lastly, or two more slides, and then I'll go to the Q&A and kind of discussion part. But this is Dove, 2007, I believe, right? And so on its own, there's no problem with this. But in the racial context and the pattern that happens day in and day out, so many people are subject to our own beauty standards. All right. My own daughter would only put white shirts on her head because she said she wanted to have long, blonde, flowing hair. On its own, no problem. But when we follow that up and start to ask, okay, well, what about your hair? And she's saying things like, my hair is ugly. And we're in a household that loves every bit of every one of us. And we have people around us that reinforce that. And it still permeates that there's something less than for my stuff. And that's what's desirable, right? And that gets us into some really problematic behaviors that even now, 3 times a year, somebody, a white person will reach out and touch my hair and say, and without talking to me, without engaging with anything around me, and immediately I now have to deal with it having been pet in public because something is different and unique about my hair. Different than what? Right? Everybody's got hair. So these are some of the patterns that are surface level problematic, and then we have behaviors that go deeper along with them. This is the last one I'll show you. This is both during Hurricane Katrina. The top picture is described as looting, and the bottom picture is described as finding bread. Right? I actually got to reach out to the Associated Press, who ran this story, because this comparison's been made in quite a few places, and they had to, address it. And one of the things that came out right away is how often the comparisons like this are done at the same events that have two seemingly innocuous events be described very differently. And then I found out in that conversation that this was a person of color who wrote both of these stories. And so again, going to that idea and understanding that we all are swimming in the sea of this and can perpetuate these things. All right. I'll also offer, if you want to really look at some of the ways in which, I see, Craig Lesher, you see, I just popped up the chat box again. Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, of course, looking at that. There's a lot of experimentation that you can go back and look at. The Tuskegee experiments, where folks, black men were told that they were being given some treatments for their syphilis, but actually they were trying to be studied to see the effects of syphilis over time. You can read about that. It says here the influx of the Orient in particular Chinese presence, based on the multitude of Chinese laborers who were imported to build the transcontinental railroad from California to meet in Utah. And the follow-up with that, where many of those folks were then sent home or looked at and told they were undesired to be here. Some of them sued to be reclassified as white so they can stay and so they could own land in the United States. And there's a whole interesting amount of case law of folks suing to be reclassified racially. So the only reason I put those on in front of you just to say that if you are getting simplified versions of history, that we need to complicate. And even what I've shown you here requires you to go and look deeper, because there's so many things like that. And so I need to start with those patterns so that we can be in a space of saying, okay, well, what don't I know? Give me somebody who says, what don't I know, or how can I understand deeper? And that is going to be an open door to learn about how folks experience the world very differently than us. And not just look at it from the statistics of the disparity data. I'll leave you with this, and then I'll open it up for questions. Regardless of how you've been socialized about race, whether you've grown up in a society where you actually had real relationships interracially, right? And I don't mean just surfacey relationships. I mean, you can actually go in somebody's house, open up the cupboard and make a sandwich. That's real relationship to me. Those patterns are essential to understanding why folks, not only the unrest is happening here on a racial, in our racial categories, but also all the things that we miss when we don't learn that experience. If we didn't sit down and have that conversation gender-wise, we would never understand that 1 out of 7 women in our own society face some type of sexual violence or assault on the part of men. We would never have that. We would never be in a position to address that data if we didn't stop to say, how is somebody else experiencing the world differently than me? How the same law enforced in one way, it looks very different enforced in a different area. So these patterns are essential for us to start understanding how those things play out. And it can take us for simple laws that seem really easy on the surface, turn into things that get implemented or enforced in very different ways. I myself, I'm a product of the Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. It's one of the historically Black fraternities in the United States. It was founded in 1911 by some teachers in the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan. When I'm a member of that, I'm walking with my Letterman's jacket and slacks and dress shoes. I'm walking in the area of the 3rd precinct. Then 2 cop cars had come up to me right near Minnehaha, where that Arby's is, right? Right in that area, I was put onto the ground, dragged in my Letterman's jacket that I was wearing with the nice white leather sleeves were all scratched up. I still have that jacket to today. And I hear over the intercom the description of the person that they were trying to look for who robbed a store recently as a 6'4", light-skinned Black man with an afro, big hair, and a blue down coat. I'm wearing a red and white Letterman's jacket with Greek letters on the side, slacks, and dress shoes. The fact that the car full of gangster disciples, who are local gang organization in the area, knew enough to, and their colors are blue and I'm wearing red in their territory. Should have been I already knew I thought I knew what was going to happen. They roll up and they basically say, "Hey, man, stay in school, blood. That's what's up. Stay in school." And then to have officers put me on the ground because I fit a description that I'm not anywhere near. I'm 5'9". At the point, I was 98 pounds or something. That's an exaggeration, but I was real skinny, right? And I had this Letterman's jacket on. And so we are all of these patterns we have to talk about openly. Because if we don't talk about it openly and we try to just look for things that fit my own worldview, then we're not actually going to be learning somebody else's experiences. We're going to be stuck in debate over and over and over again. How come this? Why not this? Why not this? Well, folks in those communities already understand those patterns. And it's not a question of whether a pattern exists. The question becomes, what are we going to do? And this idea that these communities aren't getting together and doing something about it is also a false statement, right? And so I just want to put this in front of us so that we can have a new type of dialogue that actually leans in to say, how is somebody else experiencing the world differently than me, right? This is why I can know in a Chamber of Commerce meeting in Decatur, Georgia, I can have a conversation about liberal racism that'll play just as well as I have a conversation on Pine Ridge about 2.5 weeks ago about some of the disparity work and some of the kind of power there is for learning a powerful image of your own history and your own people, right? And so I saw a question earlier, what gives me hope for the future? One of the things I'm seeing is more people are starting to say, how can I look at somebody else's shoe walk, right? Which is powerful. I'm seeing more of that happen. I'm seeing more organizations that have struggled to get by, who try to give a positive self-image of the history. I mean, the first viral quarantining practice, the understanding that germs cause sickness, the first eye surgeries were in North Africa, the first universities were in the continent of Africa. And so as the more we tell stories like that, the more we start to have a positive world image that sees somebody more like me. So I'm going to stop there because I can go on for days. There's whole courses that are taught about this that we don't get taught about can fit into a full degree program of information we didn't learn about our own history as it pertains to people of color in the United States. But I'll start to go through some of these questions here. And so, Kay says, I feel that many of us live parallel lives with the Black community. There is not one activity I do where I see someone of color. Do we just have very different interests? How do we change that? There are Black groups that model or similar to Rotary. I just named the fraternal organizations that happen. The biggest piece for me is we have been socially designed separated. All right. And so as you think about resources that you may look at, read Black periodicals. There are those, Insight News, Star Press, a few others that you can just Google search there. Listen to Black authors and Black folks talk about and describe their experiences. There are all kinds, there's a whole wealth of videos. You can do a lot of work, but nothing takes the place of actually being in real relationship, okay? And this always gets us to a conversation about Brown versus Board, separate but equal, segregation and all that, right? There's some what Brown versus the Board was trying to say is, even though we have separate spaces, they are resourced differently. And Brown's original intent was to highlight the fact that for the same policy, two different groups of people are resourced very differently school-wise. What ended up happening in integration is we actually started to see the breakup of schools that used to have Black teachers, Black social workers, and all of that. We saw a huge decline in Black educators being employed by school systems during integration. So there's this bittersweet pill of saying that when we segregate, what usually happens is folks who have resource leave. And this segregation happens across economic lines, across racial lines. So all of these resources are out there, Google them, but nothing takes the place of actually figuring out how to be in real relationship with folks differently than yourself, all right? And so I just want to put that onto the table. Another few resources. James Lowen is a historian, one of my favorite, who looks at the intersections of how race plays out de facto and de jure. And he has 3 books: Lies My Teacher Told Me, Lies Across America, and Sundown Towns. This is amazingly powerful, interesting history. Sundown Towns deals with the towns in America. Many of our suburban areas in Minnesota had racially restrictive covenants up until civil rights legislation outlawed them on the books. But then many of these communities continue to enforce those either interpersonally through different enforcing in different areas. And so those towns remain demographically homogenous across over the years. And he chronicles quite a few of these towns who still remain racially the same demographics, even though all the towns around them have changed very drastically. These towns remain predominantly white. What are the mechanisms that go into that? Sundown Towns by James Lowen's another absolute one. Lies My Teacher Told Me is amazing because he does a lot of Howard Zinn-like below the line history that just says, here's the same story and here's what was happening to people of color during that same time. Somebody said Stillwater was a sundown town. Yep, so is Edina. The Edina is actually mentioned in the book. I don't know what Stillwater is. But he talks about it a lot around the Black-white binary. So there are native sundown towns experiences that happen around too. So a lot of places. Look at all of the land treaties work that was done for Indian removal across South Dakota, North and South Dakota, the Wyoming. Amazingly powerful stories about how we engaged, right? And this complicates a whole lot of things, including Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is not the patron saint of Black communities, right? Wrong. Frederick Douglass said, wrong by choice, right by necessity. So even though we have the signer of the Emancipation Proclamation, we also know that there were conversations about how to bring the Union back together without abolishing slavery was also part of the conversation. We also know that during the same time, Abraham Lincoln was responsible for one of the highest death tolls for Native peoples in the conflicts that were happening at the same time. And so it's a complicated story. Black folks in large mass identify June 19th as Emancipation or Independence Day, not July 4th, because at July 4th, we were still slaves. June 19th is when Gordon Granger was sent to Texas to forcefully emancipate the remaining straggling slaveholding communities that were moving to Texas in order to violate in opposition to this law. And even in Gordon Granger's statement, there's a whole line of admonition for Black folks not to be idle. This doesn't give you the excuse to sit idle and not work. In the same statement that you're telling us you had to be free under penalty of death. So it's all complicated. And as long as we're telling complicated histories, we're going to be able to make better decisions and make better relationships. I recommend any podcast that makes you think deeper. What I'll challenge you to think about, though, is even in podcasts who tell below the line stories, there's an overcorrection that tends to be part of a liberal kind of viewpoint that says, I'm going to say all the right things, but even though my behaviors doesn't change. And so there's some podcasts that are really, really good information, but they also leave out some complicating factors. Can we talk about Dr. King and venerate him for what he said at the same time as we acknowledge that he was a troubled character? All right. If we can do this with the founding fathers, many of whom owned slaves, and we can be fine with telling the good and the bad and the ugly, then I'm good. We're going to have much better dialogue. If we overcorrect in the space that sanitizes, that removes the complexity, we end up in a situation where a kid learning about Black history only gets the folks who seemingly have a clean past and no complication. And what that tells kids is, in order to be like this person, you have to be somehow exceptionally, morally, all these things right. You don't need that. I'll give you this. The Education of Little Tree, who was written by the former speechwriter for George Wallace, right? It's one of the only accounts that we have of the Cherokee Indian removal that gives you a sense of what that's like. It was on Oprah's bestsellers until they found out who the guy was, and then they removed it. Why'd you remove it, right? And so I want us to have a more complicated conversation about history, overall, right? And so any podcast that does more complication, that's important, right? And then look at the comparisons and similarities at what happens there. Any other questions? I know I can go on forever because many of this can be whole courseworks. I teach courses and high school courses on this and whole initiatives on this. So I want to be open to your timing. And so I'm at your disposal. Go ahead. And I can stay a few minutes after too, if you need to. I've done my best to try to read the comment sections and follow along as best I could. But if somebody wants to unmute and ask a question directly, I'm fine with that too.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How is Gordon Parks seen in the African community today for his work? He grew up in Rondo.
Absolutely. So if you go to Gordon Parks Elementary as a kid, you know Gordon Parks. If your parents browbeat you into knowing Gordon Parks, you know it. But this is an issue that we have, is that we've got a whole society of young people who are losing these greats, and largely they don't get talked about except for kind of small speech bubbles in the sides of the margins in a lot of our curriculum. And so if you're related to Gordon Parks, or you have somebody, and if you come through Arts Us, you're going to learn about Gordon Parks. But outside of that, we don't see him, right? So Gordon Parks did some amazing work. It companioned a whole lot of other work too. And if you go in Black institutional spaces, Black churches, Black organizations, Black convening groups or professional groups or associative groups, this information gets put forward, but in a dominant space, in a kind of popular culture space, Gordon Parks isn't that sexy to our youth.
I would recommend strongly to this audience A Choice of Weapons by Gordon Parks.
Mm-hmm. I see. Thank you for that. And I see a question here, aware of the work being done with the Father Project. So this gets to, hey, George, I see your hand. Nope, you're muted still.
Can you unmute me?
Nope, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. There's no way we can solve what I want to talk with you about today.
Okay.
But to look at the number of Black people or multi-race people we have in Rotary. Now, I live in Faribault. We have about 3,000 or more Somalis, and we're trying to integrate them into our community. We have a diversity coalition. We just recently, at our last meeting, inducted Sam Oakes, who is a multiracial person.
Mm-hmm.
We've had these people in our Rotary Club before, and we can't seem to maintain them in our club. And I would like to have a more in-depth discussion with you than there's time for right now, if that's possible. If you can give me your phone number, or and I know your time is precious, but this is an important issue. We had a Rotary district meeting about a year ago before the corona. We had one black person there out of about 200. See, so we talk about this stuff, but we ain't doing it. We have no way we're not doing it. So we need help to make this happen. And there's one black man in Faribault that I've had about 4 or 5 discussions with, and his name is Dennis Hill. And I've tried to, and I know I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, king of the hill, right? I know that, and doors are open for me just because of that. So we need help, and we need some insights, and I don't know how to do it. So that's where we're going.
So absolutely, that conversation is really important. Mary, who brought me in here, Mary Vanderwoord here in St. Paul, you asked a similar question and wondering about that as well. There are 2 questions that I'd love for you all to explore, and that is, what is Rotary like that's already present in communities?
Well,
and then 2 is, when we look at our institution, I would love for everybody and their mama to join my club. But what is the need for it? Like, there's some questions that might say, you know what, is it about joining this group with this ideals and this culture and this history? Or is there ways to partner that at least gives you touch points? Because there may be a Rotary-like club. Immediately, I'm thinking about Belay, Jack and Jill. There are professional clubs that get together to do good in the communities that are there already present. And it may be less about joining Rotary because it has a culture and a history to it that need may already be met. So why be part of 2 groups? It doesn't mean that you're going to change anything about your decision, but there are just some things to think about to say, okay, well, let me look at the landscape here. It may be that you partner in those, but I'm more than happy to talk with you offline. I want to address this fatherhood project question that came up real quick, George, but I can get, go ahead.
So Rotary tends to be people who are better educated, more successful financially. We tend to be. Now, a lot of these people, the Somalis coming in, are living in entry-level jobs. They work at a turkey plant and so forth and so on. Now, is there a way to have a club of those people to help them? I don't know. A separate
you got
club, a separate division, whatever. I don't know. See, that's even discriminatory.
You got a lot of things to explore as a group, but I would challenge you to do. To ask some questions about what the landscape is and the experiences are first, and then line those up. And then just on this fatherhood project piece, I love the fatherhood project. And you need to understand that the fatherhood project scope is to the experience of about 30% at the most in certain areas, average 20% of the experience of folks in communities of color. The vast majority of Black people grow up with their fathers. Right? This notion that the fatherless or the absent father does not affect the majority experience of Black people. This actually comes because of a Center for Disease, a CDC study that came out that used the metric of married in the household. That didn't apply to a vast majority of America at the time, let alone the Black community. And so we get this stereotype of the absent Black father. Definitely an issue for a subset of Black folks, but the vast majority of Black people grow up with father figures in their life. And so I just want to put that into context that it's in fatherhood project is absolutely important, but I want you to make sure to balance that and not get the mental model that somehow absenteeism, parent absenteeism is running rampant in the Black community. The vast majority of Black folks grow up with parents. And so I just want to put that out there just to balance some of the statistical glitches that happen because our stereotypes come in to the mix. Now fatherhood program, still important, very important, particularly for areas that are really overrepresented in negative data, particularly urban centers or depressed centers economically. But we still have a majority. The same thing happens with unemployment. They talk about Black unemployment being way larger than white employment, and there's huge disparity there. Yes, but that still means that the vast majority of Black folks have jobs. So I just wanted to reframe some of those mental models in our minds, right? That also means that the vast majority of Black folks are taxpayers, right? You'll probably encounter these comparisons like, all these Black folks on welfare, and then you'll hit this tit for tat where folks will go, well, there's more white people on welfare too. Well, that's not a conversation about race. That's a conversation about learning statistics, people. Come on. So all of those things are there's always a balanced picture and full picture. So whenever I hear somebody park into a statistic, my radar goes off like, okay, what are we not saying in order to make this particular viewpoint true? And this goes for everybody. I don't care what area of the spectrum you are. Now I have time, but Ed, you might have
Yeah, we want to be respectful of
right.
everyone else's time and other meetings and so forth. So I think we may take and wrap it up, and
okay.
we will have you back again sometime to continue the conversation as we learn more and have more questions and could use more insights. I like the idea of Rotary partnering with what's out there in the community. One of our Rotarian speakers that is nationally known, Dr. Bowtie Todd Jenkins, just recently spoke at the Northfield Club, African American, and he talks about the idea of, staying away from tokenism, but really engaging with the community, and exactly what you're suggesting. And I think
what I'll offer to that is that's exactly how groups have diversified, not by trying to recruit and do things different and say, come join us in how we do things. But those partnerships alone actually end up diversifying both. The precursors to the NAACP were several groups coalescing that partnered together on activities and then decided, you know what, there's some overlap and folks begin to cross-pollinate. So there's a historical pattern that would back that method up.
I appreciate that. Want to thank you so much for your time, Anthony, and thank everyone for joining us here today. And I appreciate too, you're talking about Pine Ridge and the Native American community. In 2 weeks, our next Friday feature will feature the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community coming in, talking about sovereignty and the relationship between a sovereign nation and here in
that's going to be a huge deal because of the Oklahoma Supreme Court decision honoring a treaty that had been violated for so long. There are 16 other treaties, 7 of which in Minnesota had been violated that are now, there's going to be some interesting times ahead. So that'll be some interesting conversation to have. Fort Laramie is now in jeopardy, and folks have never taken the payout for the Black Hills where Mount Rushmore is, specifically so that they could be ready for this conversation. Imagine the forward thinking and planning of saying, we're not going to take this money for, what is it now, 120 years? No, I'm sorry. I'm doing my math wrong. 140 years, right? 160. Wow. Okay. So imagine waiting that much time and saying, we're not going to take this money so that we can be ready for this conversation that's about to happen in 2020. That's huge forward thinking.
Yeah. But it really talks to their values too. The land was so sacred; it was so much a part of them. And well, we'll save that for 2
there
weeks.
You go.
Because otherwise we can.
Ed,
Thank you again, Anthony.
Make sure that we